Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, the series where I explore human decision-making as a risk and what we can do to mitigate it. Now, in this episode, I'm returning to a subject I've explored with other guests, compliance. If you've listened to the show for more than a few episodes, you'll know that I really hate the word compliance. It's one of the worst pieces of branding ever. And while there are programs out there that fully reflect all the negative aspects of the brand, in this episode, I'll be speaking to someone whose function certainly doesn't. That's because my guest, Andra Popa, is a compliance officer with a difference. Her background is in art history, drawing and painting. How she came to be a compliance officer is something we cover in our discussion. The reason I wanted her on the show is that it's that artistic background that has influenced how she does her job. When I then tell you that she works in an industry where the consequences of getting things wrong is literally a matter of life and death, you'll begin to understand why I think her approach is interesting. That industry is healthcare, and the compliance programs she runs are in hospitals. Which explains why I wanted to speak with her. Because if you can find a way to think creatively about how to run a compliance program in an environment like that, then you'll have some fascinating insights into how others might do it. So whether you're in compliance and looking for ways to make your program more engaging, in an industry where you're subject to a compliance regime that doesn't engage you, in which case point your compliance team to this podcast and say, why can't our program be more like that? Or you're interested in how we can better manage human risk, then this is the episode for you. So please enjoy my discussion with artist turned compliance officer, Andra Popa. Andra, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And look, I usually ask my guests to introduce themselves just purely on the basis that they will do a better job of it than me. So can you give my listeners a little bit of a sense of who you are, your background, and what interests you?
Yes, I live in the United States, and my background is varied in terms of my education. In the undergraduate program, I studied art history, drawing, painting, as well as economics, English literature. And then I pursued to study law and a specialty in healthcare law. And that's my educational background. And I work in compliance.
I mean, that just in that short introduction, that's incredible because that's a real selection of different disciplines. You've got something that's very creative. You've then got something that's in the law and compliance that's very disciplined. How do you balance those two things? I mean, that's a fascinating conversation. Obviously, logically leads us to the topic that we'll talk about of sort of behavioural design and compliance design. But I'm fascinated as to how you sort of balance those two things out, because that's a beautifully eclectic mix.
I think I had to train myself. I'm naturally artistic, and when I was a teenager, I think my father had a conversation with me telling me, you need to really balance this out. It's a little bit too much because I wasn't expressing myself. I would sort of draw pictures rather than be verbal. So it was just, and he was right. So I think I really made an effort to just study things I wasn't good at. And I eventually became okay at them. And I developed logic. But at first, it was truly just a very, not artistic temperament, but just very much in my own world, So I just learned by practice. And yeah.
And I mean, it resonates with me hugely because I studied languages at university, which being the university I went to is very traditional. That ended up being literature based. It was all around linguistics. I did medieval French. So some things that were, less than obviously useful in the business world. And so when I had come out of that, one of the things I wanted to try and do was to compensate for that sort of artistic side. And I would say it was more about appreciating the arts than generating pieces myself. But I then went and qualified as an accountant. And there's a very similar narrative there, which is sort of, nobody makes any money from this thing, so you need to go and do something sensible that's relevant to the business world. And so I had a similar tension in my in my kind of education around that piece and struggled a little bit. And I don't actually, with hindsight, I sort of look back and go, why did I do accounting? Because my math is just terrible. I really shouldn't be doing that discipline. And I kind of forced myself through it and learned some things along the way. And I think that counterbalance has really influenced me, which is put me at the crossroads, if you like, of sort of very free thinking disciplines into the rigidity of accountancy. And I was sensing, as you were talking, something similar in you, in the sort of very free spirited, able to do what you want, no rules, into a space where rules are quite prevalent.
Yes, and both are very valuable because art is a business, and you do need those accounting skills, the business skills, marketing. So it was, I really did force myself, but it was very valuable, and now I can balance the two without forcing myself anymore. But yeah.
The way I came across you, like you were on a webinar talking about compliance design. And it's a topic that I absolutely love because on the face of it, if you said to somebody, well, which discipline has, limited need for design because it's just there are rules, it would be compliance. You don't really associate compliance with creativity and some of the attributes of design. And here you are bringing those two things together. So what was it that inspired you to sort of make that connection, that compliance was a subject where you could bring some of those disciplines to bear?
Yes, it was 3 experiences that happened one after the other. And then also, I really think it was my personality where I'm not a traditional law personality. So I don't have, I can't muster up this aggression or being loud in an office. My personality is the same in my personal life as it is in an office. So I had to create a way to make things work, to make people believe what I was doing. So I sort of used these tools that I, based on these 3 experiences, that was sort of the way that I could get through to people.
Talk a little, if you can, around those experiences, because I'm fascinated what the sort of trigger points are.
Yes. So I think the very first thing was I was just starting my career. So I was just happy to be there. And someone gave me a project where someone, I think maybe with 40 years of experience would have had. And I sort of walked into it. I just happened to be with the right place at the right time. And they really entrusted me with this project, which was a great responsibility. It was a very large university and they needed to obtain accreditation. And they didn't have anyone leading their project. And, they went back, they asked me, can you write our policies and procedures? Can you write a few? And I said, sure. And I went right back to my office and I called my professor from law school who, and I said, how do you write policies and procedures? And he said, well, try to keep them to 2 pages. Try to keep the policy separate from the procedure. So I had that advice and it started, I realized, the design, it matters. I had an inkling at that point, well, 2 pages is much shorter than this 300-page manual they already have. And then I started conducting interviews because to write the procedures, I really didn't know what people were doing in the office. So I went around and everybody very kindly made some time for me. I asked them just from the beginning. I said, okay, you open up your computer, you sit down. What do you do? How do you do it? And I had worked in their place, so I knew overall what I did, but I needed to see what the common pattern was. And one woman I had audited her work, and she was fantastic at her work. Everything was immaculate. Everything was extraordinary. But moving forward to obtain accreditation, we really needed people to start reading the policies. That was very important because things were changing. So I asked her offhand, I said, did you read the manual that exists? And she grabbed it. It was next to her and it was just 300 pages, but she acted like it was 300 pounds in her hands. And then and she lifted it and then it sort of fell to the ground, with her hand. And And then I realized, well, she's an excellent worker. She's extraordinarily conscientious. What is the issue with her not reading? It's really the way it's presented, And then the third event was I worked with the Institutional Review Board. It was the research office at this university. And usually I didn't chit-chat with people after meetings or anything like that, but there happened to be a book launch. So it was sort of this cocktail party environment. And a psychologist on the board came up to me and said he had heard that I was redoing their policies and procedures, checklists, things like that. And he said, there's psychological books on this topic, like where to place check boxes and how to organize things where a reader will be more likely to complete it or a reader will be more likely to understand it. And he gave me some titles that I put in my phone, and I ran across the streets of the library and, got the titles. They're very old books. They were just obviously not combining compliance, but they were, this is definitely your area, but I was just reflecting on it, and all three of those experiences are so complex because they touch on so many sort of interdisciplinary things with compliance, ethics, and what type of ethics you follow, and your area of applying behavioral science and design, which is more my emphasis. So it was all there, and I didn't really believe it when I first put it together, so I studied it. I created a research project. So, sorry.
No. I love this because I think this is really fascinating because you come at this, and I would argue that inexperience is actually a superpower in a way because it gives you a perspective on an exercise that if you are steeped in knowledge of the subject matter, you would sort of be blindsided to the potential for doing things differently because your thinking is imbued with that's the way we've always done it. And so I think there's something wonderful about approaching this quite fresh, almost with and take this the right way with a sort of child's pair of eyes and saying, well, I'm trying to solve this problem. How can I do it better? And so I'll get some guidance from people about how one might do these things, but I'm going to approach this right. And I love that image of somebody grabbing the policy manual. And I really thought you were going to say, it was kind of shrink wrapped, had never been opened, clearly not well thumbed. It's there for show purposes only. And therefore, I just love the practicality of it all, which is just sort of, well, why are we doing it this way when we're trying to solve a problem that involves people?
And it truly is not I hope I don't mean to offend anyone who came before me. And that certainly wasn't their fault. That's quite a feat to write that. So it was just it was like a child. I was just discovering things and sort of fumbling my way through. That's why I created a research project, because I was so scared that this was all so crazy that I formally obtained IRB approval and formally conducted research, because I thought, well, if it's a structured process, and I can show evidence, and this is a large university, I can't mess this up, So I think that's why I really was quite conservative with the rollout of everything. I tried to conduct, as part of the research, I conducted interviews. I would change small things here and there first, and then I changed a lot. And it was only before I got good feedback and good audit results that I then, provided everyone with this new material.
And so you're literally running on what I loosely term as gut instinct, which is a sort of feeling for how it could be done based on using your sort of artistic sense and your understanding of people and what engages them. And then what you're doing is sense checking that a little bit because actually it's quite a brave person that would step into that space and do something that is fundamentally different. So there's a lovely thing here, which is it's fueled by an innate sense of this is how it could be, supported then by some evidence that says actually this isn't just me making this. This isn't a sort of a wild card entry, if you like, for a way of doing things. It's actually supported by science and research that demonstrates this kind of technique can be effective. And you're bringing those two things together to deliver something that then genuinely, unsurprisingly from my perspective, turns out to be effective.
Yes, I also, a great deal of support was provided by, I reached out to the government agencies that were overseeing this research. And so in the United States, that's it's an office that protects human research subjects. And I said, is this okay? I would also ask the accreditation agency, or is everyone okay with this? And so because I really wanted to make sure it wasn't, because it was so much shorter and there were so many differences that I really, the most important was the core material after all. So it just gave me credibility. I could say, well, they said this is okay. And then I could present it with, credibility, because otherwise it was sort of, I didn't have credibility at that point at all, nor should I have asked for credibility. It was just brand new. So,
but that's fascinating, because you've and I love this whole story, because what you're doing here is dealing with a whole range of objections that people typically have. And so when I look at what I try to do with my clients, it's very, I will get a million reasons, not from the person that's called me in, because typically they've already bought the power of this thing, they understand it, but the people you work with. And the arguments you get are along the lines of, we can't do that because that's not the way we do things. So it's sort of a legacy argument, if you like. The second argument you get is around, this won't work. Just because it works in this context doesn't mean it works there. And then the third argument is, well, regulators won't allow it. Now, all three of those are the weakest possible arguments you could come up with, because we know that legacy arguments, just because that's the way it was invented or done ages ago, doesn't make it right for now. And shouldn't we be challenging ourselves? The effectiveness piece is, well, it does actually work. And that's why companies spend millions, billions collectively on persuading people to behave in a certain way, as do governments. And the regulator argument, you've just beautifully dissected, because you've gone to the body that is there policing this piece and said, look, is this okay? Sort of slightly humbly said to them, would this be okay? And brilliantly, they've come back and gone, yeah, sure. That's what so I love this, because you went through the processes, probably intuitively more than in a plan, that deal with the three main objections I find I come across when I present this to people that haven't necessarily bought into it.
Thank you. I did. It truly was, I think it was just so much shorter than anything before. So, and a lot of the comments I received were people just looking up and saying, are you sure this is all we need to do? And I could confidently say yes and explain why, and also the audit results really spoke for themselves, where the completion rates were much higher of checklists, and I would continuously improve things based on the audit and monitoring results and see where people were having trouble. So it was like a loop, and so it was quite logical as well. I could base it on evidence. So I think also they were happy also in the way I presented the idea. I worked in a job during law school, during my LLM program, where I created compliance content for compliance professionals and lawyers. But we were creating it within software and in electronic libraries. So I had this idea of creating a searchable electronic library, and it makes things much easier. I mean, I kind of had an idea of how people use things, for like in their work to find information. So that was also my background. So that I think I presented it in a complete logical way, so that helped as well.
Really interesting, because if you start from, so traditional logic in the compliance space, I think operates as follows. And I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this, but I think it sort of operates on the basis that we have some rules, a regulation comes down. And what we do with that is we transcribe the regulation into a policy, and then we present that to people. And the reason we do that is logically that can't be wrong, because we've taken what we've been told to do by the external authority and we've transcribed that. So if anybody said, is your policy following the regulation, you would say, yes, Because it literally is. It's literally almost verbatim, maybe with a few changes.
Yeah.
It copies it through. And then that's what we present to the end user as the thing they have to comply with. And, and that doesn't meet the end user's needs, because nobody wakes up in the morning pondering and wondering which particular clause in the regulation that they're currently dealing with. They just want to know, what is it I need to do? And how can I go about living my life? And the bit I love there is you've distilled it beautifully and said, okay, the product is not here for the purposes of saying, have we ticked have we covered all this? But it's actually saying, what do people need to do? How do I make this usable for people on the ground? And I think there's a general perception that the risk-averse approach to this stuff is if you carry the regulation and drag it kicking and screaming to the corner of people's desks, then you will magically have solved the problem. And that's a defensible argument, because you can say, like I gave it to them. Now, I actually think it's indefensible, because when else in the world would somebody sit there and read something that's long and tedious to get an answer to a question, particularly when it's not structured around the problem they're facing, it's structured around the theory of regulation. In other words, it's looking organizationally, not from the perspective of the end user.
Yes, exactly. This touches on so many points. I think also there's a real balance. So I think one of the questions you bring up is, so who are the policies and procedures written for? Who is the program for? And I would have different materials for different viewpoints. And also sometimes most times you actually do have to use the language from the regulation, because that's really what the regulators are looking for. But you can do it in a way that's understandable as well, in different ways, through your education, through the procedure, through explaining it out. But I did see some people getting in trouble where they change the language of the regulation and it doesn't mean what it started out as. So we have to be careful with that as well. So, but there are different ways to do that. You can hyperlink it at the bottom of the page. People can go to it if they want to really fact check. So yes, there's so many layers of that. Also, I think on another podcast you mentioned this idea of we're not trying to drill in rules into people, because that's not how life works. It's we want them to sort of understand the framework and maybe have habits that are good, and then use their own understanding in different situations, because it could lead to very bad outcomes if it's very strict rules that we want them to follow. And we can't imagine all of the fact patterns that are out there, so, and I thought that was an excellent point.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, because when we look at, and I think this goes to the heart of the way you've looked at things, which is sort of what outcome are we looking for? What do we need people to do? And there are going to be some things, to your point around copying the regulation, there are going to be some things where actually what is at stake is so significant. And we know that the set of circumstances in which that thing is at stake are not going to be changing. We don't ever want you doing this thing, or we always want you to do this particular thing. That you can just literally copy, copying the thing through makes perfect sense. So when I think about food hygiene regulations, or the nuclear power industry, or anybody that's dealing with electricity, there are going to be things there where, because actually what you're dealing with is based in immutable physics and chemistry, that you don't actually, the natural world doesn't bend itself to circumstance. It behaves in a certain way. So you mix water with particular chemicals, water and electricity, not a good combination. So in those sorts of circumstances, actually, we want people to rigidly follow the rules, and there's no room for deviation. And actually, this is a prime example. Do exactly what we tell you to do. No thought required. Other times, you want precisely the opposite, which is you want somebody to go, I will think very carefully about what I see around me and respond to the environment. And therefore, I take the view that the language that we use and the way that we communicate these things need to be very different according to what it is you want the end user to do. And yet, very often, we present them in the same light. And so we have these rule books that are sort of combinations of use your common sense and initiative through to slavishly follow this rule, no questions asked. And those are very, very different things that are deployed And yet we put them within the same framework and context. And therefore, we shouldn't perhaps be surprised that either we get people not using their initiative when we want them to, or equally using their initiative when we precisely don't want them to.
Yes. One of the examples my professor provides is the rules in the United States about admitting patients they're quite strict when a hospital has to admit an emergency patient. And there was one instance where there was an injury of a young boy, and his friends left him sort of across an alley of an emergency room. And per the rule, they were really, per the policy, he wasn't, on the property of the hospital. And so following the compliance rule in that case led to by the time that a police officer sort of commandeered a wheelchair and brought him in, it was too late. So things like that, where following a strict policy in healthcare, it wasn't the intent of the rule where so strict. So also thinking through the intent of the rules and requirements as well. So I think that's a great point to make. Definitely. Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by you hinted at the response that the users had to this slimmed down version. So I'm used to having this fat book, and every time I think of it in my mind, the image, the book is getting fatter, it's weighing more because that works well in my mind. You've got this wafer thin, sort of always ready to check. And people's reaction, I think, is really interesting, because in the same way that you've got the rule, right, the compliance people, if you like, that take comfort from the thickness of the book and the fact it's all in there, you've got the end user who is used to receiving their marching orders, for want of a better phrase, in that same format. And so suddenly you don't just, it's interesting. We mustn't just think about how will the compliance people react? Well, this feels risky. Actually, the end user, in a way, if you suddenly go from one extreme to the other, is going to feel a little bit discombobulated by dint of the fact that they have been brought up, they've been trained, if you like, to the fact that the way this will work is you'll have a really fat set of rules. And secretly, you may know that you won't necessarily consult them all the time. They'll be sat there. You'll put your coffee cup on top of it. And suddenly you're presenting them with a whole different way of looking. It is almost like you're saying to somebody, for the whole of your life, you've seen things in black and white. And now I'm presenting color. It's a similar sort of thing, but it's very different. It feels intuitively really good, but it also feels intuitively really wrong, because how can we possibly go from this fat sort of biblical tome into something that's wafer thin? How can that possibly be right? And so I think there's something interesting there about the target audience's reaction to that as well.
Yes, exactly. And the biggest surprise was, so compliance has to reach the entire office, or the entire, I think I worked with about 100 to 200 people. Eventually it started small and then it grew, but at least for this initial project. And it has to speak to a lot of different backgrounds and experiences. So I thought one way to explain it is everyone kind of has a different movie that they enjoy or different genre that they enjoy. So imagine that, and then you really do need for them to understand the compliance. So you have to present it in a variety of different ways. And the biggest surprise was people came up to me who never really felt included in legal things, or even that they felt that they could ever understand rules and regulations. And they said to me, I understand this. They felt that some people said that, I want to go take a certification exam. I actually understand the rules. And it was people who had sort of been relegated to a role where I don't think they were, perceived as being able to understand rules. But I think it was just the way that they were presented. I think that was the biggest sense of accomplishment for me, where it was completely unexpected. I didn't expect it at all. And
that's a wonderful way of looking at things. And I've been toying with this concept around exactly that point. And I think about it in several different lenses. One is the sort of the type of person that you are. So do you like, there are some people who love wading through what I want to see the detail. I want to dive into all of that stuff. Some other people go, just tell me what I need to know, and I'm not interested in anything. And there's everything in between. And that plays itself out into personality types. It also plays itself out into different cultures, where there are some cultures where there's an expectation or a desire to have lots of rules. Other people, I don't want to stop telling me what to do. And the opposite is right. And so there is a degree of complexity. And it occurs to me that actually we have an opportunity given what we know about behavioral science and neuroscience and the way people think, but also in terms of digital delivery, to be able to offer different things to different people. Now, we have to make sure it's consistent across the piece, but I think there's a really powerful opportunity now to avoid this one-size-fits-all, which, as you say, in the real world, we know that there are people people are attracted to different things, as you say, different movie types. So if you're foisting a horror movie on someone that actually likes to watch rom-coms, you're not going to, and vice versa, you're not going to land particularly well with your audience, which is why, and if you think, and I think Netflix is a good example where actually they offer a kind of selection of things and they try and personalize what they present to you based on your previous viewing habits. So it's a real attempt to engage you. And I show you things in a manner that will work. And actually, I read something interesting about Netflix that said even where they make the same recommendation to people, what they try and do is bridge the gap in a way that feels logical. So the algorithm will spot things that you might not naturally tend towards. Why does it think I'd like that? So what it does is it surrounds it with other recommendations that will help you bridge the gap. It's not what the algorithm's used, but it retrofits human logic to that to try and make the selection feel far more comfortable than it would do if it was just a stark presentation. And I really like this idea because I think you're completely onto something here, which is to say that if we just present a standardized one-size-fits-all thing, then it will resonate beautifully with parts of the audience. Or it may resonate with no one, but let's assume you've targeted certain aspects of it. But there are going to be other people that are switched off by that. And I think particularly in a world where we want diversity and inclusion, because diversity and inclusion get you different viewpoints, it makes you more effective, it's more interesting, it's more fun. But I think particularly with some of the 21st century challenges, we need to do that and we need to reflect the totality of society and what we do. I think in that context, this becomes really important because if you start to speak in black and white, if you talk to people in a monotone and you don't reflect the diversity of the people that you've got in front of you, you're not going to land the messages you need to land.
Yes, and it really makes the compliance job much easier, really. It's more engaging. One example is one surprise I had was that I was creating quizzes. This was mainly to evidence to government agencies that everybody was attending the sessions, that we were on board, that we were learning. But the unexpected effect was that when people were getting good marks, they were like, hey, I can do this. I can understand this. And they became comfortable with just approaching the policies. It was an online database. There was a Google search engine attached to it. They could then answer questions that they received by phone just by referencing the policy. Things became much more consistent. So you think, well, quizzes are sort of a dull, but it had a surprising effect. And the education, I just try to tailor to the audience. Like if it's physicians and clinicians, they don't want to feel that a regulator has burdened them with additional rules. So I always try to really learn about the history of the regulation, and especially in the area where I work in, human subject protections. A lot of that is based on, I looked at the initials behind the names, and a lot of them were clinicians themselves, almost all of them. So that created the foundational documents for the subsequent regulations. So I make sure to explain the historical context, why these regulations exist, just so they don't feel, oh boy, here's another rule. So it's, I try to think a lot about everybody's experience, including the government auditors. I feel like that's my work, is creating an experience for everybody, that they have a positive experience and learn as a teacher, kind of creating an experience.
And I think that use of the word teaching, I think, is fascinating, because if you said to somebody in compliance, what does your job involve? And generally, it's not a conversation you even have, right? Because people, it's not the first thing you say to people, generally speaking. Hi, pleased to meet you. I work in compliance. I mean, that is going to have all the attraction of sort of tax inspector or some other. It's not a particularly exciting. And I think for me, the perilous thing about the compliance practice, it sends a signal, which is you're here to tell people what to do. And actually, what you've just depicted is I think, a lovely image. And I always think back to the teachers that were really good at school were the ones that knew how to communicate what they had to communicate in a manner that resonated, and they really got to people. And they weren't just the ones teaching for the exams. They were getting you excited and enthused about things. And you had teachers that were amazing, that could take the most dull subject and make it fascinating. Equally, you have ones that had incredible, like the raw material that you've got here is phenomenal. And you have managed somehow to mangle that in your head, and you've communicated it like it's the most boring thing ever. And that ability to engage people, I think, is a key component of the compliance discipline. We always think about it in terms of you need to know the rules. You're an expert in the rules. But actually, I think the discipline's around translate what it says in the rules into reality. It's about teaching, guiding, supporting, nurturing, engaging with humans. Now, none of that comes across in the compliance badge. Those are not the skill sets that we would naturally think of, that we probably don't necessarily hire for, and that we don't think about training compliance people in. So in many respects, I think the compliance badge and that sort of image that you've painted of someone teaching feel like they're at odds with each other. And we need to kind of try and square that circle a bit, and to really bring some of those disciplines that we see in other professions that are actually the essence of what the compliance role involves.
Yes, exactly. And now that I just reflecting on that first experience with restructuring a program, or providing a compliance program for them, I realized that most, if not all, of the misunderstandings were because people didn't quite know what compliance was, or there were very basic questions. Why am I walking around in the morning? Why am I talking to everybody? Things like that. Some people thought I was just being social, inappropriately social. Why, but it's just to make a rapport with people, feel approachable. People then could bring their concerns to me. It's really important. Figure out, are the procedures still on point? Is there people veering off in a different direction? We just need to update, Another point was, I wish I would have been clear about this, is the idea of compliance shouldn't report to someone in operations. That shouldn't be the design of the program. So design can also be the abstract. And there were situations where I didn't feel like I could report to higher and higher levels because I was in operations. So it was that is, and now I think you're nodding your head. It's obvious that you should never have that kind of reporting structure. So that is an aspect of design as well.
That's interesting. When I think of compliance design, I think about the design of the end product. And maybe it shouldn't even be thought of in terms of product, but designing the outcomes that you want. But interestingly, actually, the design of the function itself, which is what you've just highlighted, also plays a key role. So its branding, its positioning, its reporting line, all of that's just as important.
It's extraordinarily important. And even the design of the entire program, yes, the entire structure from a very high level, and that includes abstract things like walking around, making yourself approachable, where you sit in an office, being accessible, how you present yourself, even your what you wear, what everything like that. I think has an impact on the accessibility of the program. You talked a lot about education, the educational program. How is that structured? Sometimes we would make games, like in the US we have Jeopardy. I don't know if that's in the.
Yeah. We've shamelessly stolen it. I think licensing is probably technically correct, but yes, it's a global phenomenon.
But things like that where you can make, and there are side effects to that are unexpected. You might have greater team unity. a camaraderie, laughing during education, smiling, people cheering each other on. It could be fun too. It's just a human, to bring emotion into it is also, like I told you about that hospital case, that was emotional. A fun game, that's emotional. Just having some kind of emotion.
I mean, it's making it human. And I think this is what the whole piece is about, right? Which is to sort of say, okay, we have a desired outcome that is from the organizations or from a societal perspective that sits there. We have to do that. But how do we operationalize that? Well, the answer is it's the people that we need to influence. And so I have this very simple piece that says organizations can't be compliant of their own accord. It's the people within it that determine whether the organization's compliant. So I almost say stop focusing on the organization, but focus on the people within it. Because if you get the people within it to do what you want them to do and not do what you don't want them to do, then by magic, the organization itself becomes compliant. It does the thing that you need it to do. But if your start point is, I will shout at the organization, I will treat it like an organizational problem, then you're not going to solve it, because actually it's the people on the ground that constitute the risk or the mitigation of that risk. And that's what you need to target.
Yes, exactly. And again, I'm not a social scientist, so I don't have extensive research in the area. I've tried to publish about 1 or 2 papers a year on the topic, but it's for about 10 years, but they're not social science research. I just have sort of one social science research project that I did, but I think this area will become parsed out greater. There's so many opportunities to, especially you have so much data now with auditing and monitoring that you can really change courses very quickly and say, well, this is one of our high risk areas. We're still not resolving it. The government's come back to us 3 times about this area. If they come back a 4th time, they might shut us down. We have so much data now, especially I think in this area.
And that I find fascinating because so if you look at compliance as, and I'll steal shamelessly from Rory Sutherland that was previous on the podcast. Yeah, he sort of says, well, compliance is kind of anti-marketing, and it's said clearly with a massive amount of tongue in cheek, but it's basically his point was, marketing is about persuading people to do something. Compliance is about persuading them not to do something. Now, all sorts of reasons why that's a slightly flawed piece, but as a general start point, it's interesting. Now, if we look at what people do, the effort that goes into marketing campaigns in terms of designing them, in terms of monitoring them, you're not allowed the budget to go and do a big ad campaign unless you have some sense it's going to be successful. And yet, for some reason, compliance isn't subject to that same level of scrutiny or review or indeed response. So when we get the feedback that our compliance program isn't working, typically it's feedback that's received after something has gone wrong. Let's go and review whether we did that right. I would look at it in the way that I think you do, which is to say we should be getting ongoing feedback of this, not just in terms of are people doing the things that we want them to, but actually what do people think about this? How do they feel about it? What's their general perception of the way that we come across? What's our brand recognition? What's our, do people like the product? Do people not like it? Not that you have to be 100% popular, because there are going to be some things you need people to do that aren't necessarily the things they're going to want to do. But this idea of constantly monitoring, and I love that idea that you talk about there. And I think that many of the metrics that are used to measure compliance are very backward looking. And they're sort of when something's gone wrong, the horse is well and truly bolted. We will spend a ton of money looking at something because we had a hideous outcome that we really didn't want. Now, my view is there's lots of early warning indicators out there that might help you before that, which is people on the ground telling you the realities of it. To your point around walking about, if there is a policy that irritates a heck of a lot of people, then that's a really good warning indicator that is something that when push comes to shove, or even maybe before then, they might try and circumvent somehow. So use that early warning indicator and do something about it before someone circumvents it, rather than just sort of treating it, it doesn't matter what they think because they've got to do this anyway. Actually take that as useful feedback. That's an early warning indicator.
Exactly. That's exactly correct. I completely agree. And yes, things can be retooled. There could be more education, better education. Clearly something is being lost in the translation. So yes, exactly. That's, I organized it around these principles, auditing, monitoring, policies and procedures. The compliance director role and the abstract line of, of reporting. And there are about 8 of these that are not, I didn't invent them. They're just part of the U.S. sentencing guidelines, as well as this Department of Justice in the U.S. Guidance. And lately, the latest one that they issued is really very much focused on a really tailor-made, bespoke program. And you almost have to justify exactly why you organize it a certain way. So it's also good. It's also good for the company to tailor it to their audiences. Then you have a really logical way to present everything. You say, well, we focused a lot of education this year for 6 months on, security from working from home security, because that was our last 3 breaches of privacy were related to that. So it's such a high risk area. It's just logical. I guess it becomes very, like, you tell a story that's true. It's not a false story.
I think that's interesting, actually. And I will point, I don't know if you've come across something called the Table of 11, which is something that was invented in the Netherlands.
Oh, no, I have not. No.
I owe huge thanks to Roger Miles, again, a previous guest on this podcast, for pointing me in this direction. But this was something that they created in the Netherlands in, I think, the 1980s or 90s. And it was basically a table of 11 factors that you needed to consider if you were going to introduce a new law. And so it was really looking, and it wasn't just sort of simple kind of, is this effective? Right. And does this do what it needs to do? But it was looking very much around behavioral things. So is this issue understood by the target audience? So will people understand why we have a rule about this? And will they understand the risk? So not just will they but will they understand the risks that you're running? And will they think the measure that you've got is proportionate? And so what it was looking at doing is saying, before you effectively put proverbial pen to paper, what you need to do is to be thinking about how this will land with it. What is the target audience's perspective on this? And so it comes from a sort of, it's almost a consensual legislative approach. And that's not to say that if the target audience doesn't think that this is a good idea, it doesn't say we don't do it. But what it means is we recognize the scale of the challenge is larger. And so you should ask yourself the question, why are we implementing this particular rule? Because if the general public doesn't understand what it's there for, then has the general public got a good point, right? Are we actually just doing something stupid and pointless? Or is the fact the general public doesn't understand it a challenge that needs to be overcome, because actually the thing that they don't understand is really important? And so if we recognize they don't understand it, we can design it in a way that recognizes that lack of knowledge or that objection to it and works with that, rather than assuming blindly that they will understand, or they are forced understanders of it and therefore accept it. So I'll send this to you after the show, and I'll put it in the show notes as well for people listening. But it's a fascinating, a very, very old school thing that I don't think they particularly carried through, but I thought was brilliant, because it started from the premise of we are not speaking to a sort of homogenized bunch of people that are entirely on the same page that we are, that are willing supporters of every single thing that we do. Yeah. And I thought it was lovely, because actually when you're writing rules and creating things, is you're spending your whole time looking at that. The target audience isn't. And the target audience doesn't often care about these things unless it knows why it needs to care. And so if you start from and I see this in large companies where you have people, I'm responsible for an annual process. So something that people do once a year. Now, if your whole job is around that one, you're going to look at that process very differently to somebody that has never seen this thing before, has to do this as part of a load of other tedious processes that your perspective on it is going to be very different. And so you need to put yourself in the shoes of the target audience, rather than assuming that they will naturally understand why what it is you're asking them to do is important and critical. Because if they don't understand it, they're going to make their own mind up. And if their position on it is different to yours, then your best efforts are not going to come to much, because the people you're trying to get to work with you are going to come at it from a different perspective.
Yes, that's exactly right. I realized I really believe in starting at the bottom in any kind of job. So I really tried to learn exactly what people were being evaluated on and what their jobs entailed. So literally did it myself. And what I realized was they're sort of against the clock. They have to produce X amount of letters per month, per day. So that's their goal. And if you're adding a lot of checklists and a lot of this and that, yes, it's very important to explain why. And also I did keep an eye on the productivity. Is it falling because of is it normal to fall a bit at first, or did it go back up, and things like that? Because it shouldn't affect productivity. It should just be seamless, where it's part of the habits of everyone. So I did try to empathize with, and I still do try to empathize very much with how people are actually going to use the items. And
I could keep talking to you forever, because I think it's like, I love your approach. It's fascinating, but we are clearly running out of time, and you have these valuable things you need to go and do in your job. But the final question for me is, as I look at what you're trying to do, it's a massive mission, because we come back to these legacy pieces around compliance, not necessarily coming with the strongest branding. How do you measure success? I mean, clearly there's a sort of, no bad outcomes, but what things do you do to know that you're landing with the target audience?
I think there are small successes that are maybe personal to me, where people say, I understand this, or I get this, and I see improvements in the personal audits. I see personal improvements. And then I think when you really see a 0% error, or at least, you start with an extraordinarily high amount of noncompliance, where it could be 80%, and then you see close to zero, where that tells you they understand the policy, they're implementing it, they're operationalizing it. And also on top of that, they're very confident with their jobs. Maybe they perceive their jobs have meaning if you explain why, what they're doing exactly. So I think it's a lot of various factors. It warms my heart, obviously, to see compliance after an audit, but really it's really the small wins, I think, because then you can pivot and go more toward what people like, or change the rudder, I guess, toward what's working and what's not.
I think that's a lovely, lovely quote on which to end. So, Andra, thank you so much, for just the ideas that you've had. Anybody that is out there challenging the orthodoxy of compliance, but doing it in such a charming and considered manner, I think is a pleasure to have on what I view as the team that I'm on, which is really trying to change the way this functions. So I'm delighted to hear about what you've been doing, and fascinated by that. And I want to stay close to that, because I think you've got some really interesting ideas that are born from a really understandable start point. But thank you also for coming onto the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's been lovely. It's been an honor to join the podcast. Thank you.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Andra for appearing, and to you for listening. If you're new to the show, then you can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. Now, normally at this point, I ask people to leave 5-star ratings for the show. And if you can do that, it's hugely appreciated. But do also feel free to send me your thoughts on the show. That helps me plan future episodes. For links to Andra's website that explores some of the techniques she's used in putting together her compliance program, have a look in the show notes. I'll be back with another episode very soon. If you're interested in learning more about human risk, the work I do with clients, then do visit the all-new human-risk.com website. It's also the place to go for links to the Human Risk newsletter and video channel. If you're on social media, you'll find me on Twitter at Human Risk Blog, and do feel free to connect on LinkedIn. Just search for Human Risk and you'll find me. Please stay safe. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.